Anyway, let's move on to the next question. This one from Kyrith or Kirith, I don't know. Hello, DF! Exclamation point. Wonderful week of visuals as per usual! Exclamation point. When we look at PS4 games ported to Switch, we call them quote unquote impossible ports because the generational divide in fidelity is profound. Yet, when discussing the odd pacing of the current gen consoles, I keep hearing the argument that the lengthy cross gen period was justified because consoles just aren't that different from each other anymore. I think this argument is nonsense. Alan Wake 2 on PS4 would be a quote unquote impossible port on par with The Witcher 3 on Switch, while God of War Ragnarok is clearly a PS4 game ported forward. The Horizons, Forza, and Forbidden West are the only cross gen games that feel legitimately transformative on current gen hardware. I just don't think this scalability is solved, so cross gen is fine argument holds water. What do you
Hmm.
think? What do you think, Alex?
I don't know if Alan Wake 2 is the best example.
You could
I would
scale
almost,
that, it just wouldn't be using the same systems, right? It would be
yeah,
very,
yeah.
the whole geometry pipeline would be redone.
I think something like a UE5 game might be better. One that only works with Lumen. And then if they made that work on PS4, I would say that is then impossible because Lumen doesn't scale down to devices of that compute power reasonably. I think we've shown that with Steam Deck having troubles in spite of it being a newer architecture.
Mm.
Um, like Steam Deck is okay, but like soon as Lumen kicks in, the resolutions would be pretty unacceptable, I think, on a PS4, which is tied to a TV and not a little screen.
Yeah,
Yeah.
UE5 is actually a good candidate also for the CPU footprint,
Right.
which is vast and would never be done on a Jaguar.
No.
No.
GPU, I
Gosh.
don't think it would be too much of a problem on say,
Yeah.
an Xbox One X or even a PS4 Pro if you really shrunk the
One X
resolution
should
down.
be able to run it for sure, actually.
But you
Yeah,
still
it's
got the
just
CPU problem, which would
got the
be
CPU issue.
which
Yeah.
would be a big problem. So yeah, that's an interesting one. Any thoughts on this one, John?
Yeah, I don't think it's so much just about brute forcing. It kind of hinges on what features are being exploited by the developer and whether or not the hardware target can support it. Like things can be scalable as long as it's like actually capable of those techniques. And we saw that a lot with the Switch quote unquote impossible ports. The Switch GPU is perfectly capable of what games in like Intech 6 and 7 were doing, right? They have those features just much slower. But if you
Yeah.
built your entire game around a specific feature or function like mesh shaders or something that doesn't really function on the last generation GPU, then the problem there isn't so much scalability as much as like, well, we need to find an alternative solution that actually would be workable on these platforms. I don't think the actual visual fidelity of Alan Wake 2 would be impossible to get looking pretty similar enough. It's just that the way they develop the game is kind of somewhat incompatible with how that system works. It's the
Hmm.
same as like on paper the Switch is probably more capable than say like the Xbox 360, right? But it feels like they're kind of in a similar ballpark in terms of what they can deliver. It's just that the Switch has a more modern GPU that supports functions that the 360 simply cannot. But if the 360's GPU were more robust and those features had those more modern features, I think it would produce. I think you could see much more modern stuff running on that older
Yeah.
system. So it's.
Yeah.
Right.
I think it really just comes down to that kind of stuff more than anything else. So everything's scalable up to a point, and obviously, as you go back in time through consoles, the functionalities diverged more per platform. Like in the PS2 era, there's a lot of stuff on like say Xbox that if you build around say pixel shaders, uh you could find a way to do something on PS2, but you largely had to come up with a completely different solution because the PS2 did not have programmable shaders at all. Which is what we saw with stuff like say Reckless, the Yakuza missions, right? Which got a GameCube and PS2 port. On Xbox, it was a shader showcase. It was an amazing looking game, but it was 30 FPS. They ported the PS2 and GameCube, and it was 60 FPS, which was cool, but they drastically altered the visuals because those platforms could not do it. So that type of port, I think, of Alan Wake would actually be possible on the Switch, but it would require them to redevelop the way things were done to work in a completely
Yeah.
different way. But given the increase in budgets and development times, I don't think it makes sense. It's prohibitively expensive to do that for a minimum return.
Yeah. Super minimal
Hmm.
return at that point. Yeah.
Anything more to add to this? That when he's talking about here, Kyneth says the argument is what's he saying? I keep hearing the argument that the lengthy cross-gen period was justified because consoles just aren't that different from each other anymore. I think that's kind of half of it. The other
Yeah.
half is simply the commercial necessity of having to support cross-gen to
Oh,
make the projects financially worthwhile.
beyond that,
And
go ahead.
so, and the other point is that they are um, uh, similar in ways that we probably haven't seen in a prior console generation before, because it is fundamentally x86 CPU cores and Radeon GPUs. So there is that commonality there.
Also, game development cycles have become much longer, so a lot of games in this cross-gen
Yeah,
period were in development before those machines were available, and they were not using any of the newest cutting-edge stuff. So it makes sense to scale them down because, well, they were already kind of targeting that level of hardware in the first place. Now, I feel like the
right.
product, in most cases, once a developer has released a product on, like, let me think about like Insomniac, right? Miles Morales was in development for both of those things, and then once they shipped that, they when they started working on Spider-Man 2, I'd say that the PS5 was already out at that point, so it didn't necessarily make sense to target that older hardware. Whereas, previously they
Mm,
maybe Insomniac's not the best choice. Maybe Guerrilla Games, actually, with Horizon Forbidden West, where that game was in development for a long time and the PS4 was still viable during its development. And so I'm sure it was mostly in development for PS4 with an eye on the next generation, saying like, well, when we get the PS5, whatever it is, we'll take advantage of it by adding features to it. Whereas
Sure.
if it had started development when the PS5 was already out, we may not have seen that.